Welcome to this week's episode of Rank Class. And for this week, I will again talk about something from World War II that we need to talk a bit more about. So let's start talking about the German army. It did something people have never believed was able to happen, and they did it rather fast. And when the African and Russian campaign began, the German news in the occupied countries showed how well the war were going. And then a lot of people actually joined the German army, even though they were not for Germany. And people came from around the world. People who came from other places to join the German war effort. People in the occupied countries who actually joined up. And it actually happened in basically all occupied countries. And today we will all say they did the wrong thing. But if you look at their point of view and what was going on at the time, most news showed how well the Germans were doing. And the ideas of hate and so on were never far away. And it's still not far away. It's something that's always been in humans. And we are not moved away from hating people who don't look, act, or believe as we do. But they did join up and did help the German army fight, mostly in Russia. But most countries don't talk much about this when you see documentaries about it, since today is looked at as a bad thing. And it is true, it was a bad and dumb thing. But that did not stop people from doing it because they thought it was right. And we need to acknowledge that something was wrong at that time of point, since people did this. Another thing people tend to not talk that much about is when the war was over, people began to kill and molest men and women who had had sex or fallen in love with a German officer or a German soldier, or who have helped the Germans. So men were often killed by leaders of a resistance cell, and women were shaved bald, beaten and forced out of the city they lived in, with swastikas painted on them, so people were able to see that they have slept or helped the Germans. Since the hate to the Germans were so massive. And sadly, it was not really looked at if they had helped the Germans or fallen in love with someone they wanted to help them, or if they actually didn't have a choice other than to help them due to they needed food or being able to keep their work and so on. And it's something you only rarely see in movies or series. I remember Band of Brothers in the episode about Operation Market Garden, you actually see it happen. But other than that, it's something that we rarely talk about. And the names and terms given to people who did this is still used today to talk about traitors or people who helped the enemy. And I'm sure wherever you're listening from, you know a term for that kind of person. And it possibly started back then. And I won't say any of the terms I know here because I don't like saying them. Now the next thing to talk about is the people who were actually forced to help, who didn't have a choice to say it. When the war began to take a hard hit for the Germans, they began to, in a bigger and bigger way, force people into work parties, since the German men and boys were needed to fight the war. So they rounded up millions of people to work for them. And they were either forced to build stuff like the Atlantic Wall, cave system, bunkers, or operate factories. And they did not care if you died doing this, since you were not German. And if you die, they will just go and find a new person. And lots of people died this way. We all know about how the Jews were worked to death, and Russian prisoners of war were worked to death. And they were forced to work in SS-controlled places next to SS camps, where millions were worked to death. But we tend to forget all the people from the occupied countries who were taken from their homes and sent to different parts of the Reich to work to their death. And millions died this way. And if a bombing run hit a factory, it sadly often was manned by forced laborers. And it is sad that we, in our telling of the war, we always remember the big people like Hitler, Stalin, Goering, Churchill, Eisenhower, Rommel, Manfred, Roosevelt, and all the big battles. But in all of this, we often forget to talk about all the people who was affected in this way. And we do talk about the Jews, and we tend to forget the prisoners of wars, and we almost never talk about the people who were forced there to die, especially from France. And it is millions who were forced to die. And I don't say that the Jews didn't suffer or the prisoners of war didn't suffer, but I say they all suffered, and we need to remember all of them, not just part of them, since it will make their sacrifice. They gave their life. They were forced to give their life, and we forget about it, and that is sad. And the next thing is, I'm not going to say that some people are better than other people, but I do also find it interesting that during this war, black soldiers who came from the USA, who had basically no rights in the States, but they still came to fight in Europe to give Europe our rights back, our lives back. And we tend to also forget about that chapter of the history, that while fighting for the right for freedom and religious freedom, they came from a place where they didn't have any of that. And we need to remember all of this and honor history to make it right, to remember that everyone can do a bad thing and good things. But if we forget to look at it all, we get this lopsided picture of history, and it does ourselves a bad favor, since it makes a false painting of who we believe we are that we actually ain't. And that can lead to, sadly, bad effects. And it's just like last week, the last episode I made, I talked about how I sadly see my family history often get overlooked due to my family only lost one family member to the Germans. And the brave people of the resistance cell lost almost an entire family. But we need to remember all of them, to own up to what they did back then, and to honor the people who is overlooked, people who don't have a voice anymore, people who lost their life. We need to remember and honor all of them. I hope this episode made you want to look up some history that you want to look into, and you begin to think different on history about what is good and what is bad. And remember to see history from the eyes of the people that you are actually seeing. And if you want to hear about my family, who was part of a resistance cell called Hvidstensgruppen, then you can listen to that episode. And you can also share this episode and find me on social media. I'm on Reddit, Facebook, Instagram, Patreon, and you can listen to all my episodes on all podcast sites and YouTube. And I wish you all a very nice day.